Where are the low value men? Like, what are all the low value men up to during these trying times? Because the high value men, I know they're around. They won't shut the fuck up. Low value men, I have not heard a word out of. I'm starting to think I'm on their side. I think I want one of those. I want a low value man. They don't make podcasts. I haven't seen one low value man make a podcast. Do they not know how to use microphones? Maybe that's a good thing. That's hot. All right, I've never seen a man use a microphone for good.
Until now, everybody buckle up. It's low value mail time with your host, Danny Polishchuk. Howdy, Scroats. Welcome back to an all-new episode of Low Value Mail. Hope that's not too loud. If it is, tell me. I was having a couple sound things before we got started. This is episode 109. Look at that. Look at us. Episode 109. And joining us today, we have Steven Snider, a.k.a. Recluse, and we are going to be talking all about Stanley Kubrick. And I'm pretty pumped for this one. I don't know about you. You can't be pumped because you didn't know that this is what we were talking about. But now you can commence being pumped. Before I bring him on, I'm going to bring him on in 1 minute. But before I do so, please, everybody, like the stream. If you're watching over on Rumble, like it, subscribe to the channel. Some of you watch the show, but you're not subscribed for whatever reason. I don't know if it's because you fucking hate me, which is fine. That's fine. But if you don't hate me, please hit that subscribe button and hit that like button. I would very much appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to support the show and make this show become the butterfly, it's currently a caterpillar. What the fuck am I talking about? Anyways, you can sign up patreon.com/lowvaluemail, MAIL, for $5 a month. You basically get... Basically, you just help the show and get all the audio episodes without ads. And a lot of you listen to the audio. A lot of you are out there and you're listening right now and you're like having to listen to some fucking bullshit ad when for like $1 a week or some shit, you wouldn't. What is that a day? 15 cents a day? And I'm the Jew. Sorry. I've had a very, very long day. We got a new episode of The Bathhouse tomorrow night at 9 p.m. live from the Stand Comedy Club and Green Room. Lisa Ann had to reschedule. Actually, she didn't reschedule. It was the other guy, Brett, who she does a show with. He had to reschedule. She wanted to do it, but they're going to come on together. So they're going to be back. They're going to be on next month. But tomorrow I got a banging episode. We got Chloe LeBranch, Corinne Fisher, and Joey Avery. So that's going to be a fun one. Check that out. And that's going to be the last Bathhouse I'm doing for like 3 weeks because I'm going to be gone. So come check that out before I blow this pop stand, if you will. And also, if you don't want to sign up, you can sign up for the, become a YouTube member like all these people are, who I respect. The rest of you don't respect. So do with that what you will. All right. I'm done rambling. I'm done. I promise I'd finish rambling. Hold on. Let me do this thing. I still haven't, you'd think I'd have like a good system for like, just, like I'd do this whole thing really quickly, but still no. Here we go. Let me ask to unmute him. One moment, please. All right, let's go. We got Steven Snider on the show. How are you doing, sir?
Doing well, sir. How are you doing tonight?
Excellent. Yeah, you know what? So I'm hearing, I don't know, people tell me if you hear it sounds like a little echoey, but I don't know if there's anything we can do about that at this point. Welcome to the show. So you are, this is a longtime curator of the VISUP blog and host of the Farm podcast, both deal in parapolitics, pop culture, and high weirdness, which I like. You're also the author of 4 books, most recently The Minotaur, a Kubrick Odyssey, which we are going to be discussing tonight. So how are you doing, man? It's nice to meet you.
Doing well. Nice to be here, man.
Okay, great. So it sounds like it's just on my end, so perfect, no issues. So you've been doing this blog for what, like 15 years or something? I was checking it out today.
Yeah, roughly speaking, I think it was around 2010 when I started it. So yeah, getting up here with the big 15.
Nice, nice. Congrats. And so you've written 4 books currently on Stanley Kubrick. So you had a bunch of stuff that you wanted to talk about. So I guess let's get into it. And we're going to open up the phone lines in about maybe 20-ish minutes. And if people have questions, they can they can talk to you. So you have the one, because I feel like the moon landing thing, I feel like that has become has gained a lot more traction among just like kind of popular culture, that the moon landing was faked. I think people are starting to, I don't know exactly what the reason for it is, but that was not like a common conversation you would have maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And it seems to be much more common. You're saying that it's very unlikely that it happened?
Well, I don't have an opinion necessarily one way or the other on whether the moon landing was faked itself. I'm saying that most likely Stanley Kubrick was not the one who was involved in faking the moon landing, which is a common trope associated with this particular conspiracy theory.
Right. And so what particularly, why do you believe that? Or what evidence have you come across? Or not?
It goes back to like when Kubrick was first linked to the moon landing, which was all the way back in the mid 1970s, which was interesting. But in the early days, the linkage did not have anything to do with him actually faking the moon landing per se. Essentially, this goes back to the first book that was written on the moon landing potentially being faked, which was by Bill Kaysing. I think it was just called like, Did We Ever Go to the Moon or something like that? The $30 billion NASA boondoggle or something to that effect. So in this book, he puts forth the notion that Kubrick was involved in developing the technology with 2001 that NASA later used to fake the moon landing. And his evidence for this consisted of, on the one hand, the budget of the film doubling from, I think, something like 4 million to like 7 or 8 million during production. And then on top of that, the fact that NASA was directly involved in the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey. So those are problematic if you've actually looked at Kubrick's career kind of in the long term. For starters, his budgets typically tended to balloon a lot. That was pretty common with virtually everything that he did. And actually the jump in budget was way more dramatic with Barry Lyndon. I mean, I think when he brought that sucker in, finally, it was like $14 million, which was quite a lot in 1975 or so. And then on top of that, Kubrick always consulted with experts on any kind of film that he made. The prior movie that he made, Dr. Strangelove, he had consulted with, what was it, the International Center for Security Studies or something like that, which is essentially the British version of the RAND think tank, and a lot of other big national security poobahs. He was following people like Henry Kissinger and a lot of the work that they were putting out on nuclear strategy. And nobody ever really talks about that, or the very strong possibility that Kubrick was actually being linked information by the Kennedy administration itself. So the guy always had insider access as well. So that doesn't necessarily make anything about 2001 to be especially peculiar. But the most, I think probably the biggest issue with trying to determine the Kubrick or try to argue that Kubrick actually faked the moon landing is pinpointing a time frame when he could have actually done it, right?
Yeah.
Because Kubrick, like all public figures, he kept meticulous records of what he was doing. He has voluminous amounts of notes that had been up at the Stanley Kubrick archive in the UK. There's just all this other stuff. And some researchers have managed to go to the point where they've almost reconstructed what Stanley Kubrick was doing on a day-by-day basis when he was filming 2001. And there's just no point in any of this where he could have gone off and filmed the moon landing footage. I mean, even assuming that he didn't direct it like a normal movie that he did, where, they shot for 400 days or something like that.
Yeah.
This isn't something that he just could have done like over the weekend with a couple of beers and a skeleton crew. This would have been.
Yeah, this would have been. And so how was NASA? You said NASA was involved in 2001?
Yeah, they were definitely consultants with it. And that's where you do get into some weird stuff, because apparently NASA had wanted to work with Kubrick in 2001, partly to see how the technologies that they were developing would look cinematically. So why NASA would even care about something like that in the mid 1960s is a little baffling.
Sure. I'm sure it
But
gets the conspiracy people's minds going for sure related to this, but
yeah, it's just not. And then in the other sort of time frame people point at is maybe after 2001 was finished, but before we actually had the moon landing in 69. So there's roughly about a year there where Kubrick could have hypothetically have done it. But at that point, he's working on his Napoleon project. He's doing all kinds of research with that. He hired a crew of Napoleonic scholars to work with him. He's got assistants going over Europe to find cannons and uniforms and stuff that were used in the Napoleonic Wars. So it's just like, once again, his movements are really well documented. There's paper trails for what he was doing. So the question becomes, when could he have actually found the time to go to some sort of secretive studio to film this? I mean, for instance, Lookout Mountain is commonly put up as a place where he could have filmed the footage, but there's just nowhere where you could point to him being in Los Angeles for an extended period of time that he could have actually done something like that.
right.
So this is the kind of stuff, it just doesn't really hold up to a lot of scrutiny when you really sit down and look at his movements and that kind of thing.
Interesting. And so you said that he had some links to JFK?
Yeah. Almost certainly. And that sort of goes into the links that he had with the group of filmmakers around the actor Kirk Douglas. And for a lot of years, the Douglases have sort of been the vanguard of Hollywood liberalism. Michael Douglas really took up this for his father going into the 1980s and, supporting the Sandistas and stuff like that. But Kirk Douglas was part of a group of filmmakers active in the late 50s onward that were really advocating a lot of progressive policies in terms of the military industrial complex. And some other people that were tied up in this milieu would have included Kirk Douglas's frequent co-star, the actor Burt Lancaster, and also the director John Frankenheimer. A lot of these guys ended up working for Kirk Douglas's production studio during this time frame. And there was a lot of interesting movies that came out of this milieu. So you got the two Kubrick films that he did with Kirk Douglas, Paths of Glory, which to this day is still considered one of the best anti-war films ever made. Spartacus, this was one of the films that helped end the Hollywood blacklist because Dalton Trumbo got screenwriting credit for it. Then the movies that Kubrick didn't do included John Frankenheimer's The Manchurian Candidate, another movie he did with Kirk Douglas called 7 Days in May, and then a later film that Frankenheimer did through Douglas's production studio called Second, starring Rock Hudson. That's a really underrated film as well. But these were some of basically the beginnings of like the parapolitical thriller genre here. There's all kinds of implications about what the Pentagon was doing. Obviously, there's all kinds of speculation about how the Manchurian Candidate played into the Kennedy assassination. And Douglas, he was plugged in with these circles. He had been working for the U.S. Information Agency as a kind of unofficial ambassador for years like that. And certainly he was a major campaigner for JFK, as were several other people around Stanley Kubrick in this time, like Shelley Winters, who had starred in Lolita. But the big thing you got to kind of remember going back to Spartacus is this was a movie that was really controversial when it came out because they had Dalton Trumbo in the credits. It really took a pro-labor stance. It depicted the Romans as imperialists. And the American Legion, which was a very powerful organization at the time, it was tied in with a lot of fringe right-wing groups, had threatened a major nationwide boycott against this film because of Trumbo being listed in the credits and all this other stuff. JFK actually went and saw this in theaters shortly after he was elected president, but before he assumed office, and then had gone out and meet the press after he had seen the movie in theaters and praised it to them. So Kennedy directly took a stand for this Kubrick film very early in the director's career. And when you get into Dr. Strangelove, there are just lines in this movie where there's just no way that he was not getting insider information. I mean, the real kind of notorious line is the segment with the George C. Scott character where the president is grilling him and he asks him, how many civilian casualties will we have if we do the nuclear exchange with the Soviets? And he says something like, Mr. President, 20 to 30 million tops. I mean, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but the thing is, this is basically verbatim what Kennedy was told in a highly classified National Security Council meeting during this time. He essentially asked that question, how many casualties? And that's what he was told, 20 to 30 million dead. There's just no way that Kubrick could have gotten numbers that were that precise based on the available literature at that time frame. He had to have been getting insider information, and just from the connections alone that he had to Douglas, with the strong possibility that Douglas was being, well, there's no question that Douglas was being encouraged by Kennedy to adapt 7 Days in May. There was the support for the Manchurian Candidate adaptation that Frankenheimer did. It just really, I think, stretches coincidence that Kubrick was not getting information for Dr. Strangelove.
And did JFK, did they get it, like, was he getting in trouble for going to see that movie and kind of not having a negative reaction to it?
Well, yeah, he definitely would have gotten pushback because the American was it? The American Legion was really tied in with a group called the American Security Council. That was sort of the Heritage Foundation, the Council on National Policies, or something, if you will, of the Cold War. It was described by one scholar as the heart, if not the very soul, of the military-industrial complex. So this was the group that got a lot of financing from the military-industrial complex, and any kind of boycott that a group like the American Legion would have been doing would have been coming from a group like the American Security Council at the top level, because this is where the funding is coming from. This is sort of the beginning of James Mears' dark money network around Richard Mellon Scaife and the Koch brothers and people like that. So yeah, Kennedy was definitely getting pushback for supporting something like Spartacus.
Interesting. And so I know you cover, I want to talk about the predictive programming in a lot of films, and specifically Eyes Wide Shut. Because do you have any thoughts on the fact that he died like shortly? Because I know there's a whole thing where they did a screening of it, and then from what I heard, they wanted certain parts of the movie removed, like the studios or whatever, and then he died before it actually came out.
Well, they did the screening of it, I think, with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, who were married at the time, and I think a few other Warner's executives. And they did not request cuts from it, but it was generally believed that there would have to be some kind of edits made because it hadn't been submitted to the MPAA yet. And almost inevitably, there would be some questions in terms of what they could or couldn't show at the mass ball. But no, I really don't subscribe to the notion that Kubrick was assassinated. Kubrick did not live an especially healthy lifestyle. I mean, there's no real signs that he ever did narcotics or anything like that, or was a heavy drinker, but he had been a heavy smoker since roughly the time that he was 12 years old. He continued to smoke quite heavily all the way up through the making of The Shining, and he basically continued to smoke during the productions of his films for the rest of his life. He was a workaholic. He frequently only slept 4 or 5 hours a day for most of his adult life. During the production of Eyes Wide Shut, he was working between 12 and 16 hours a day. I think with the editing process, he had been working almost 16 hours a day nonstop for several months at the time of his death. And on top of that, the filming of Full Metal Jacket, the outdoor combat sequences and stuff like that, they actually filmed that at a decommissioned, I think, industrial plant in the UK, where a lot of toxins and stuff had been dumped. So there's some thinking that Kubrick might have developed health problems as well from that, and also the paints that were used in the sets of The Shining, because I guess apparently they were filming the production for so long under these really heavy lights. It was insanely hot, so they had a lot of chemicals that were being released from the paint into the air that he was inhaling through all that. So the point being, Kubrick had really done a number on his body by the time he got around to making Eyes Wide. I don't think that there's really anything unusual about him having a heart attack, especially after working 16 hours a day for, 3 or 4 months at that age.
Right. So, and on the predictive programming stuff, what have you specifically kind of uncovered regarding that, or at least thoughts on that?
Well, you mean on predictive programming in general?
No, in his films.
You would have to maybe point one out to me specifically, because I'm not really a big believer in the notion of predictive programming in the first place. But I would have to think specifically in terms of like what you're getting at. Like, is there some specific instance in the film or something that you...
Oh, I just thought that there was like a lot of, specifically with Eyes Wide Shut, that there was just a lot of theories around that. I thought that maybe that would be something you had covered. Excuse me.
Well, yeah. Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, no, no. Sorry, I was just had something in my throat.
Well, I mean, I don't really. I mean, definitely in terms of him trying to do a depiction of an elite cult in the film, I definitely think that that's pretty spot on, though. I think that a lot of the stuff that he showed in the film, though, really to this day, has not been especially well deciphered by a lot of people. I mean, there has been some progress made, I think, in terms of realizing that what he was trying to show with that film was a kind of elite cult of Saturn or something to that effect. But even then, it just seems like that this is confabulated with a lot of the standard allegations of satanic ritual abuse, which, in my opinion, was not what he was really trying to depict with the mass ball per se.
Right. And what are the Saturn references? Because I saw you were referencing that in 2001 and Eyes Wide Shut. He was a big proponent of that.
Yeah, I definitely think that Kubrick suspected that there was some kind of Saturn cult amongst the elite, and possibly one that had passed down for a number of years, if you will. So I think you can first see that with 2001 and what I think is essentially a depiction of scrying that appears throughout the film. And for those of you unaware, this is essentially when you're trying to put yourself into an altered state of consciousness by staring into some kind of mirror, typically a dark obsidian type mirror or something to this effect. Scrying was the method that theoretically John Dee was using when he received the Enochian keys from the angels and this kind of thing. It was sort of a more recent adoption of a much older tradition that was known as theurgy, which went back really to very the furthest regions of spirituality or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But essentially, this sort of ties into the notion that the human soul originates in outer space. In a lot of traditions, it resides in the Milky Way. So there are two gates that lead from these celestial spheres to the earth. One of them opens up when the soul is incarnating, and then another one opens up when the soul or when the physical body has died and the soul is returning to the heavens. So the ancients, probably beginning with the Egyptians, it seems that the Egyptian Book of Dead is a sort of manual for this. They believed that you needed to go through this process of ascension back to the heavenly spheres while you were still alive so that you would know the path that your soul had to go through after your body had died. And this was essentially a practice that was continued throughout Gnosticism, through a lot of Neoplatonic sects and a lot of these other groups. And I think that this is very much what Kubrick is showing in the Stargate sequence after the HAL 9000 has been dispatched by Bowman and you get all the trippy lights and stuff like that. It sort of happens when you get a conjunction of planets. In this case, it's a conjunction with Jupiter, but in the original conception, it was supposed to be for Saturn. And I think what is happening there is Bowman's consciousness is leaving his physical body and is going through this Stargate into this sort of realm where he's surrounded by these extraterrestrial beings that essentially have transcended all space and time and physical bodies, if you will.
Sure.
And this kind of goes back to a lot of debates that have been going on amongst the agents with the Gnostics, as to whether or not the gods actually had physical forms, if they had ships, and all this other kind of stuff. So you could do that. And then there was the other path, the path of descension. And for the ancients, this meant that you could also summon these celestial intelligences, the gods from the different planets and so forth, and you could draw them down so that they could enter you either in possession or into some kind of receptacle. There's a lot of these accounts from the ancient world of talking statues and things like that. And it's kind of believed that you would do these ceremonies, summon these consciousness down into these statues, and that way you could communicate with them. In more recent years, you sort of do that with incense and stuff like that and magical rituals and that kind of thing. And you kind of get a sense of that, I think, as well in 2001. You sort of have the opening sequence set at the dawn of man when the monolith appears and you've got Moon Watcher sitting there and he's staring into this thing. I think in this case, something is actually entering into his mind, and that is where he's getting this advanced knowledge to first create the early weapons that enable his tribe to dominate the watering hole. And this is something that Kubrick continues on with The Masked Ball and Eyes Wide Shut. I talked to the great Peter Mark Adams about this, the author of The Game of Saturn, and he very much believed that this was a recreation of a Saturnine ritual where you're trying to summon something down. That's essentially the purpose of the orgy, to create this kind of sexual energy that'll be attractive to some kind of non-human intelligence to enter into the realm. And uh, having it at the time frame of Saturnalia, which is why you see all the Christmas stuff constantly invoked throughout Eyes Wide Shut. This is when I believe the gates of Capricorn specifically would be opening up, and it's when you would be able, the maximum time, to summon some kind of entity down from the heavens. And I think that that is really the connection between 2001 and Eyes Wide Shut that a lot of people overlook.
And do you think Kubrick was like, did he practice any sort of kind of occultism stuff himself? Like in terms of this, I've never really heard of the Saturn cult thing. Like, are there other like famous people who have, or known people like aligned with this kind of thing?
Well, I'll start with the Saturn cult stuff. First off, yes, there have been other instances of Saturnine cults that the elite appear to have been involved in. Getting back to Peter Mark Adams, he wrote, I think I mentioned before, this excellent book called The Game of Saturn. And it goes into one of the earliest tarot decks that's ever been found. It's known as the Soul of Busca, which came from Italy around the 15th century or so. And this deck seems to depict the process that I just described with theurgy, where you can send your intelligence into the heavens, or you can summon down some kind of entity, in this case, summoning Saturn specifically. The deck seems to be an account of the rituals that you would go through for this. And this deck has been found amongst the Venetian nobility, as well as some of the noble houses in Germany and also in London. So this is one of the first indications of some kind of Saturnine cult surviving from the ancient world. It's most likely that this might have also been hidden away somewhere in the Eastern Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church, because really Neoplatonianism, Gnosticism, this kind of stuff never really ended. You also had like the Hurrian Sabians and that kind of thing in the Middle East, where there's still evidence that they practice this kind of Saturnine magic. So this is another point of transmission. Maybe the Crusaders ran into some of this stuff, but there are definitely indications that it survived from the ancient world into the Renaissance. And then getting into recent years, you see an attempt to recreate this with the Brotherhood of Saturn in Germany during the Weimar Republic. And the Brotherhood of Saturn was an offshoot of the OTO. This was the same organization that Crowley later became involved in, that was really well known for the sex magic rituals that they practiced. The Brotherhood of Saturn had their own sex magic rituals, but they were distinct from the ones that Crowley had developed, though it would seem that there was later transmissions between the Brotherhood of Saturn and some of Crowley's disciples, like Kenneth Grant. But anyway, as it gets into Kubrick, one of the books that he used to research Eyes Wide Shut was an anthology that came out. Actually, I don't know if anthology would be the right word, but it was a book that came out in the 80s called Cult and the Occult. It was edited by a guy called Peter Brooks Smith. And it's basically a collection of all of these different kinds of esoteric practices with these scholarly essays on them. So you've got sections on tarot, you've got sections on astrology, and you've got a lot in it about sex magic. And based on accounts I've read of Kubrick's copies, he was definitely interested in this. He had a lot of passages in these sections that were marked and so forth. And in the sections in this book on sex magic, there is an English language account of the Brotherhood of Saturn. In fact, it would have been one of the earliest that was even written. And I certainly think that this is something that would have appealed to Kubrick for two reasons. A, because Kubrick was obsessed with James George Fraser's The Golden Bough. He read it religiously. And if you've ever read that, you know that Fraser puts a lot of emphasis on the Saturnalia. There's a lot of analysis in it. He really thought that it was central to understanding the killing of the Divine King ritual, which is essentially what the Golden Bough is based around. Kubrick very much subscribed to these notions. He was very into this. So I think that that would have stood out to him because of the emphasis that Fraser put on the Saturnalia in the first place. And then the other thing about the Brotherhood of Saturn, several of the members connected to it were involved in the Weimar film industry during the 1920s before the rise of the Nazi era. And specifically, they were involved in a very famous film called Nosferatu, which I'm sure you probably heard of.
Yeah, of
And
course.
there's actually symbols in Nosferatu from that the Brotherhood of Saturn later used in their cult. So Kubrick was definitely a fan of German expressionism and Nosferatu, and I believe that if he would have made that connection, that would have made the Brotherhood of Saturn even more intriguing to him. But certainly you do see a lot of indications that there was this awareness in certain elite circles throughout the ages leading up to the modern era when you started to see a lot of these references to a Saturnine cult amongst the elite turning up. And this is the type of thing where I think it does speak to the sort of insider access that Kubrick had, because what he's trying to show here is a lot weirder, frankly, than people I think have really begun to understand.
Yeah. Do people still practice? Like, is there still people practicing, like in the Saturn Cult Brotherhood? I guess that's what you called it.
Yeah. The Brotherhood of Saturn is still with us. I don't know that it has the same kind of mystique that it would have, I guess, maybe 30 or 40 years ago. But it definitely seems like there have been other attempts to adopt some kind of Saturnine philosophy in a lot of different circles. I know David Beth has done some stuff with that. You see some Discordian circles bringing in a lot of these notions of Saturn as well. So if anything, I think that this is making a major revival going into the 21st century.
Hmm. All right, everybody. The phone lines are open if anybody wants to call in. If you have any questions for Stephen, 1-888-949-2969. So, how did you get? I mean, obviously, he's one of the greatest filmmakers ever. But was there something specific that got you? Because it seems like you probably have turned up every corner of everything Kubrick. Was there something specifically that started you down this path?
Kubrick's been my favorite director actually since I was in high school. Yeah, no, I'm actually cried the day Stanley Kubrick died back in 1999 when I read about that. So yeah, I've lived with it for a long time. I've always kind of wondered why exactly I revere Kubrick so much because I wouldn't even necessarily place any of Kubrick's movies in my top 20 all-time favorite films. Maybe top 30, certainly top 50, but definitely not in the top 20. But I think it's just because they're so rewatchable. It's like almost as many times as I've seen some of his films, like The Shining, for instance. And that's not even one of my favorite Kubrick films, but it seems like every time I go back and rewatch this picture, I find something new about it. And I've never had that experience with another director where I can just kind of endlessly go back and rewatch a lot of these films. And it always seems like, in a lot of ways, that it is a different movie, which is just something that I find to be quite remarkable. And I feel like partly why I started working in this book in the first place was to try to figure out why I'm so obsessed with this.
Interesting. And what about the, 'cause you had a note about the link between Kubrick and Roman Polanski?
Oh yeah, well that's an interesting one. He and Polanski were actually pretty good friends. I was surprised to learn going back prior to the Tate LaBianca murders. So Polanski had actually visited Kubrick at his manor in the UK in I think it would have been around 67 or something like that, and screened The Fearless Vampire Killers for him. And they had remained fairly close friends throughout, I believe, the rest of Kubrick's life. Certainly, Kubrick had not distanced himself from Polanski after the allegations came up about him. Well, I shouldn't say really allegations at this point, when he came up that he had raped a 14-year-old girl. Um, and the interesting thing about that, too, is that Polanski had actually raped the girl at Jack Nicholson's mansion while Nicholson supposedly was out of town. And Nicholson had kind of gone into seclusion after that. And in fact, he had gone to the UK to make The Shining. with the production of which stretched on for nearly 2 years. So it's kind of overlooked, but that was kind of a low-key way to get Nicholson out of the country at the time when a lot of the media fervor was gearing up around the Polanski allegations, and to kind of downplay the role that he had in a lot of that. Because you got to remember, Kubrick had known Nicholson for a while, at least going back to the late 1960s. In fact, Kubrick had originally wanted Nicholson to star in his ill-fated adaptation of Napoleon's life. This would have been like shortly after Easy Rider, and it's possible they might have known each other since the 1950s. Nicholson and Kubrick both uh, attended parties at this guy. I think his name was Samson de Breyer. He was this self-described Hollywood witch, big into occultism and stuff. He had these kind of salons in Hollywood in the late 50s going into the 60s that had a lot of weird people show up. Nicholson was a part of this scene. Kubrick was a part of it. James Dean was there. I believe Vampira also showed up. And I think his legend has it James Dean had actually gone to this guy's house shortly before his death as well. So Nicholson and Kubrick went back a long way, and even after they had made The Shining, Kubrick tended to jettison actors after he finished making films with them. He would become very close to them with the stars, usually during production, and then he almost never spoke to them again after the film was finished. But he and Nicholson stayed close, and he even had Nicholson checking up on Vivian Kubrick, his daughter, after she had relocated to LA in the 1990s. So there was that kind of interesting connection with that, because if you're familiar with the Manson killings, Nicholson was a part of that whole circle around there as well. And that was another question that I kind of had when I was researching this, was how much Kubrick possibly knew about the Manson killings as well.
And was there anything? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I
was there any
definitely
involvement or kind of
I don't
ties?
I don't think that Kubrick would have had direct ties, but there's a lot of stuff on the periphery that indicates that he would have certainly been following it. So to begin with, you have to sort of go back and look at his relationship with Polanski, but also his brother Paul, or his cousin, excuse me, Paul Prevaler, who was also active in these circles. He was an ex-LA cop who would later be convicted of murder, but in the 60s, the late 60s, he was occasionally working at the Playboy Club as security there as a former LA cop. Polanski was also a frequent guest of that, and Polanski had become very close to Hugh Hefner during this time frame. Hefner was actually the guy who bankrolled the film that Polanski made after the Manson killings, Macbeth in 1971 or something like that. And that's super interesting because if you've seen Secrets of Playboy, you know that Hefner was basically running an Epstein-style operation out of the Playboy Mansion and the Playboy clubs. I mean, this stuff, all of the Playboy clubs were wired to the gills with cameras, with sound equipment. Same thing with the Playboy Mansion. Hefner compiled a massive trove of pornography involving all kinds of celebrities from these endeavors. Supposedly, after he died, a lot of this stuff was put on a boat and was thrown in the Pacific Ocean, though that's kind of been debated as to whether or not all of this stuff disappeared. But that's super interesting in terms of the rumors surrounding the Manson killings, namely that for years it's been alleged that it partly involved pornographic films. The motive for it involved pornographic films that Polanski had been making. He had been making films with Sharon Tate, with people like Peter Sellers, with a lot of these other actors and stuff around there. So you get
He was
other
making
people.
pornography with Peter Sellers?
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want a pornographic film with Peter Sellers in it, right? I mean,
It depends what accents he's doing, I suppose. But yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
Peter Sellers was another one who showed up in these circles allegedly where they were doing the tapes with them. So yeah, yeah.
right, right. All right, let's take a call here. 1 second, please. We got one of our favorite bathhouse callers, Rube Star. 1 moment, please. Let's get him on here. Come on, Rube Star. There he is. Rube Star.
Hey, I don't know how you get these interesting guests, but these are great guests that you get.
Right.
I'm going to make this real.
Shout out to Mark.
I'm going to make this real. Okay, shout out to Mark. I'm going to make this real quick. 2 questions. Steve, when's your birthday, if that's not too personal to ask?
December 17th. I'm a Sagittarius.
Me too.
What year?
1982.
Okay, here's my real question. I caught you talking about the 9.
I'll be talking about the 9 until the day I die.
What's the 9 for people who don't know?
Hold on. Let me just throw out my question, then I got to get off the phone, Danny.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard Sammy Hagar talk about his connection to the 9?
No, I haven't. That's an interesting one, but that doesn't entirely surprise me. I believe Sammy Hagar had alleged that he had a couple of UFO encounters, right?
Okay, so I'm listening to him on Howard Stern years ago, and he says he's approached in his bedroom as a kid, and it's this group of people known as the 9 or these entities, whatever, and it affected him profoundly, and it helped him craft and guide his whole life. And like either his production company or some his label, something in his business is named the 9 after that. That's all I had. I just wanted to throw that at you.
That's
Cool.
really interesting.
All right, thanks, Rupsar. So what's the 9 for people that don't know? I actually have never heard of it, so that would be me as well.
All right. Well, that actually ties in a bit to Kubrick here in a roundabout fashion as well. So the 9, the first time that they appear in the current incarnation in recorded history would have been New Year's Eve, 1952, going into 53. There was a seance conducted with a Hindu guru, I believe, named Vinoid, and a doctor named Adrena Puharich. And there was a following seance that was held roughly, I think, 6 or 7 months later in 1953 that also involved Vinoid, Puharich, and a lot of other Yankee blue bloods. You have members of the DuPont family, of the Astor family, a couple of other big names who were all present and accounted for this. So they were supposedly contacted by a series of entities who claimed that they had transcended beyond physical form and that they existed outside of time and space. Later, they were linked to the Grand Enid of ancient Egypt, the sort of 9 deities that were worshipped at the Acropolis, I think it was, but don't quote me on that. So anyway, there seems to have developed this sort of quasi-cult around the 9 over the years. Most famously, Gene Rodenberry became involved in these efforts I think it was officially in the 70s or something like that, but there's been rumors for years that there were a lot of references seeded into the Star Trek franchise based on the 9, especially when you get into the shows that started in like the late 1980s with Next Generation going forward. Q, for instance, the kind of trickster alien that appears throughout Next Generation seems to have been based on the 9, and most specifically within the show DS9, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. That's set on a space station outside of a planet called Bajorn, and there's a wormhole there with these, again, entities in it that have transcended time and space, that have no physical bodies, that are known as the prophets. So it's long been a question of a lot of researchers into high weirdness as to where exactly this stuff came from and how credible it even was. So Andrea Puharich is an endlessly fascinating figure. He would be brought back into the military, to the army specifically, not long after he had the first seance, and he had been meeting with representatives from the army and other elements of the Pentagon prior to the seance. So it seems that Puharich, after he re-entered the military, had done some work for Project Artichoke, which was the joint Pentagon and CIA behavior modification program that predated MK Ultra. It was never a part of MK Ultra, as is currently claimed, but in fact, the two programs were separate from each other. There was a lot of really weird stuff that went on with Artichoke. It might even have been weirder than what was done with MK Ultra. Puharich's research, there's not a lot that's come out as to what he did for this, but some of the descriptions I've found indicate that it involved some kind of narco-hypnosis that was done on women and younger kids, probably teenagers, to use them as couriers and other things of that nature. It's interesting in terms of the later experiments that he did with the space kids in the 1970s, but that's neither here nor there. So anyway, where this gets really weird is the whole thing is freaking weird, right? But
Yeah.
where it really starts to go off the rails is when you start factoring in Leslie Stevens and all of this. So Leslie Stevens was the creator of the original Outer Limits. And there's a lot of evidence that the original Star Trek actually grew out of the Outer Limits. Like specifically Robert Justman, who was a producer in Outer Limits, actually put together a lot of the crew that filmed the original Star Trek pilots, and he would continue to be a big figure in the Star Trek franchise throughout the rest of his life. So Chris Knowles has made some really compelling arguments that Leslie Stevens was possibly aware of this stuff with the Nine. And I think that there's a good possibility of that. His father was also known Leslie Stevens, but he had Admiral Leslie Stevens in front of his name, unlike his son, the filmmaker. Admiral Leslie Stevens was involved in the National Security Council's Psychological Strategy Board during the late 40s, early 50s. He was being briefed on all the stuff that involved Artichoke and its predecessor in Bluebird, all this other crazy behavior modification stuff, all the things linked to UFOs and this other kind of stuff. It was rumored for years that his son, Leslie Stevens, was putting in some of the revelations that his father had given him into the original Outer Limits. And definitely, you go back and look at that show through that prism, there's some really weird stuff in it. But also, you've got some episodes like Galaxy Being, which is one of the ones Stevens personally wrote and directed. In this one, a brilliant scientist summons an alien from, I think, sound waves. This creature does not exist in time and space. It's transcended physical form and effectively lives in radio waves. So kind of starting to see a bit of a pattern here, right?
Sure.
All this stuff with these beings that have transcended physical form that exist outside of time and space. So gets even weirder. There's a guy working for Leslie Stevens and Daystar Productions on the Outer Limits and all this stuff. His name is Alexander Singer.
What year is this?
This is the early 60s.
Okay.
Eventually becomes a director. He had a really good friend when he was growing up in New York. That friend was Stanley Kubrick. In fact, he was the guy that got Stanley Kubrick to start directing professionally back when he was working for Look magazine in the late 40s. Singer would continue to work for Stanley Kubrick on his early films. He was involved in Fear and Desire, Killer's Kiss, and even did a little work on The Killing. Leslie Stevens really dug what Singer and Kubrick were doing visually. He loved the look of Kubrick's early films. And that was part of the reason why Alexander Singer was later hired to work with Leslie Stevens at Daystar Productions on the Outer Limits. And then later, Alexander Singer becomes a director for the Star Trek franchise in the late 1980s, going into the 90s. He directed something like 20 episodes combined of Next Generation, DS9, and Voyager during that time frame. So you can kind of step back and look at this, and it seems like within these certain circles at Hollywood, somebody was trying to plant these seeds about this peculiar notion of this intelligence from at least this non-human intelligence that supposedly existed outside of time and space. And I can't help but think that this was possibly one of the influences in Kubrick's conception of the extraterrestrials in 2001. Because they're essentially in this same paradigm that had been put forward by the extraterrestrials shown in the Outer Limits, what the Star Trek franchise would later start to develop with Q, with the Prophets, with all these other different figures that you see. So you definitely could kind of think that there is something really weird going on in Hollywood in the 60s with science fiction that's continued to this day, possibly.
Sure. Seems like there's something always weird going on with Hollywood. We're going to take another caller. One moment, please. We got Lucas on the line. Thank you for patiently waiting for those that are on hold. One moment, please. All right, Lucas.
Hey, what's up, man? I wanted to ask a question to your guest.
Go ahead.
Hey, are you European?
Do I sound European, bro? I'm from West Virginia, man.
He does not sound European.
No, you look European. You look Basque. You look like you got Basque in you.
That's funny. You're not the first person to tell me that I look Basque, actually. But
Really?
Oh,
as
so you know the Basque
That's
country,
a
right?
specific look, I'd say.
well, yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, it's kind of interesting though, because I mean, I do have a lot of or not a lot, but I definitely have the Scots-Irish ancestry from here. But so the Basques, they're mainly based out of Spain and that kind of area by the Pyrenees. That's also kind of like on the other side, you've got southern France and what have you. And I've seen speculation that, when you go back however hundreds of millions of years or whatever, when essentially you had one giant landmass before the great earthquakes and stuff that gave us the modern continents, Appalachia might have been connected to the Pyrenees. So who knows? It's just sort of bizarre though that if somebody's like looked at this, how much you seem to have like a lot of this cultural overlap between these regions kind of in the Pyrenees here in like Appalachia and then also like in the Scottish
Yeah, they're called the
Highlands.
Neanderthals. They're called the Neanderthal. The Basque people, they usually call them the Neanderthals because I'm Basque. I got the same structure of forehead and ridge and everything, just like you. I thought you were Basque too. I think you might be, bro. Bro, we know.
No, I've definitely
Yeah.
had somebody suggest that to me. And for those of you wondering, like the thing with the Basque is the DNA, what is it, the mRNA negative or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of this is, or go ahead, man.
Oh, well, I was gonna make a joke. It's like, they say like, oh yeah, we're the real Jews. It's like, well, like I think Basque people are the real like we're the people because their language is insane. And I wish I could speak it, but I can't even. I don't even think I can even go there, to be honest. But
They don't speak Spanish?
I feel like they are the people. They are the people that did it. They don't speak Spanish. No, they speak Basque.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a totally different language. Totally.
It's like the
It sounds
strangest
like
language. It's like it kind of vaguely sounds familiar, but it's like supposedly unique. Like it has almost no basis in the Romantic languages, if I remember
I think
correctly.
the Basque people. I think the Basque people are the people that didn't get like and biblically, how everybody got like their languages changed and separated. I feel like the Basque people weren't a part of that whenever God did that. I feel like that they were the original. So you could be original Jews, but I think the Basque people are the original people in the world. I think their language is. I'm still learning their language, but it's
I gotta check it out. I always assumed they were just speaking some variation of Spanish. I never heard them speak though. I just assumed being in Spain.
It'll sound Japanese sometimes. Sometimes it'll sound like Asian, and sometimes it'll sound Spanish. Sometimes it'll sound like Arabic. It varies. It's crazy.
All right.
But anyways, Matt, do a what is it called, 23andMe or something, or you got to maybe you're Basque, man. All right.
Well, you got to be careful with that stuff, though, man. 23andMe and all that stuff. I actually think that they're trying to harvest a lot of this DNA stuff for a lot of the data mining that they're doing right now.
For sure.
I mean,
the crazy thing is how they use it to catch cold cases, where you're like, if you do a 23andMe and you have like a cousin who was a serial murderer like 40 years ago, they're gonna go find them.
well, it's like the Mormon Church is just obsessed with that. I mean, they actually have two huge data centers right there in SLC by the the big temple that they've got that are dedicated just to compiling all this genealogy and stuff like that. And it's been rumored that the LDS actually partly owns 23andMe, and I think the other was an Ancestry, I think, the other big one too.
Yeah,
So
that's actually pretty cool, guys. I'm gonna get off the phone now, but dude, actually, that's really interesting that you're literally saying that. I didn't even think about that because that makes sense because it's very popular and everybody's doing it. So yeah, maybe they are trying to fucking harvest. But anyways, guys, you guys have a good night, man.
Thanks, man.
you too, sir.
Thank you, caller. We're gonna take another caller in a second. I actually had one question about. I was meaning to ask this earlier. So, like you're talking about the Kirk Douglas thing, and so how he was like so tied in, and Hollywood was so tied in with the government. Is that like a similar thing to kind of Operation Paperclip, where they're essentially just trying to use movies, kind of like the way they're using newsrooms to kind of get certain messages out?
Well, I think you mean Mockingbird.
Or Mockingbird, not Paperclip. Sorry.
Paperclip was
the
bringing
other,
the Nazis back.
Yeah, the Nazis. Sorry, yeah, Mockingbird. My bad.
But yeah, I mean, I don't, because everybody always assumes that this was like unified under like a paperclip thing, and paperclip or excuse me, now I'm
No,
going.
sorry. Yeah, I
It's
got that
okay,
in
it's
your head.
okay.
I apologize.
Mockingbird specifically was just targeting the press. There was nothing really in there with Hollywood. I mean, I think, but I mean, obviously everybody does use Hollywood for propaganda purposes, but I think in the case of the Kennedy administration, this was more of a private initiative on their part because, again, they were really becoming concerned with the state of the with the military, especially at this point in time. I mean, I think Daniel Ellsberg walked out of Dr. Strangelove and said something like, "This was a documentary, not a comedy." I mean, frankly, it was closer to being a documentary, I think, than a lot of people have ever truly realized. So the military was just obsessed with launching a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union at the end of 1963, because that was supposedly the last window of opportunity that we would have where we would have overwhelming nuclear superiority and could theoretically wipe out the Soviet Union in one fell swoop if we were to launch the attack. And there was pressure continuously being put on Kennedy throughout his administration to greenlight this. The military had actually come up with this thing called Operation Northwoods that they were going to use to essentially launch false flag terror attacks across the United States. They could blame on the Cubans and the Russians for the purposes of launching these strikes. So that's kind of another thing where you have to put Dr. Strangelove in this context. Is it was originally supposed to premiere on November 22nd, 1963, which was the day that Kennedy was actually assassinated on.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But assuming that he wasn't assassinated, the movie would have come out right at the time when the Pentagon would have tried to put the maximum pressure on Kennedy for these nuclear strikes. So there were really high stakes with this. The military was doing their own propaganda efforts through a lot of grassroots groups like the John Birch Society and so forth. And then you have people within the Kennedy administration who are going through Hollywood circles, people like Kirk Douglas, to try to counter this propaganda. So again, this was just a crazy time. And I mean, just from the standpoint of what they were doing with the psychological warfare on both sides is really fascinating. And it's kind of what makes Dr. Strangelove for me such an interesting movie, because it's a piece of psychological warfare criticizing the military's use of psychological warfare on the American public, if you will.
Right. All right, let's take another caller here. I don't know what this person's name is. I think they said it's L'chaim.
Hello.
Right. Hello. Who are we speaking with?
L'chaim.
L'chaim. Okay. What's up?
What's up, bro?
I really appreciate Steven for taking some of the heat off of us, because we get accused of owning Hollywood.
Did you call him? Hold on 1 second. Did you call him Steven? Did you pronounce his name Steven like the number 7?
It's okay if you
Steven
did.
Steven sounds a little bit more eccentric, and
okay.
I'm just going to go with it.
Oh, okay.
As long as you don't call me Steve, bro, I'm fine with it.
So I don't think you're Basque. Are you part of the Polish Tuk tribe?
I have no idea on that one. Like I said, as far as I know, I'm just a redneck from West Virginia. Scots-Irish, a bit on my mother's side, and then some German and English ancestry, I think, on my father's side. Though I would have been from, oh gosh, I know the region in southern England now.
So if you're from West Virginia, your wife's side is the same as your sister's side, probably.
Fortunately, I'm not married, but I guess it could definitely be a hazard here.
Sure. So, what's up, caller?
That's a joke.
That's all right.
But
man.
I'm excited that you're taking some of the heat off of Epstein, and that being perhaps a Mossad operation, and you're bringing it back to Hugh Hefner, who was a goy. And so some people think that the Jews own Hollywood, but thank you for bringing us that just because they had to go to Hollywood because they couldn't get jobs anywhere else. But if they're accused of owning Hollywood, that's anti-Semitic. But then they
they definitely run Hollywood.
But you can't say that, though.
I mean,
that's anti-Semitic.
It's not anti-Semitic.
You can't say that. You can't do that. You can't do that.
I mean, I'm Jewish, and I just said it, so.
Do you
could you admit that the Jeffrey Epstein thing was a totally Mossad of plant?
I mean, there's certainly some things that obviously is getting a little derailed, but there's obviously some things that are like, you know, some certain cases to be made for it, no question.
What's getting derailed? Where I'm trying to bring us back on the rail is that we're trying to scapegoat the goy like Hugh Hefner when we're ignoring the fact that Hollywood is, in fact,
who's trying to
totally
scapegoat
Jewish
Hugh
operation.
Hefner? We were just talking about Stanley Kubrick and Hugh Hefner.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
you seem very defensive.
so then my next point is, do you think, as a Stanley Kubrick buff, and these people who go on these Charles Manson like obsessive things are a little bit concerning to me. Do you think Stanley Kubrick actually did he have something to do with the moon landing? Do you think that we landed? On
we
the moon or not?
we already covered that, and the answer
Oh,
is no.
good.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, man. All right. We get some kooks here and there. It's just part of the game. All right. Let's take another caller. Thanks, Steven. 1 moment, please. Who we got here? Okay. I think we got. Well, I think I know who this is. I don't know if you're into numerology at all, but we got our resident numerologist. Hello.
What's going on, Danny?
Hey, what's up, man?
I'm doing good, brother. Hey, Steve, how you doing, brother?
Doing well, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I'm a big fan, dude. I've seen you a couple times on Tinfoil and some other things, and I think I really, really dig your work.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Also, I wanted to say I totally agree that Seconds is one of the most underrated films ever.
Yes, very much so.
Is that in your top 20?
Underrated. I don't know if it would be in my top 20.
What's your number one?
Raiders of the Lost Ark, bro.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay. Good
I
movie.
can't help it.
Okay.
I saw that movie like 1,000 times when I was 5 years old, and it's been kind of permanently etched in my brain ever since.
It is weird that like now a 5-year-old just watches like Toy Story over and over again, but like because me and you were like the same age, but when you were 5, yeah, you just watched like Raiders of the Lost Ark over and over again, shit like that. That probably a 5-year-old should not be watching.
No,
Well, it was originally supposed to be rated R, right?
No, it was PG, but I mean, that was actually before they had the PG-13
The rating, the PG-13.
They had to come up with that for Temple of Doom, but yeah, there's definitely some pretty intense stuff in Raiders too, like the Well of Souls thing with the snakes and stuff, and the end with the skins melting off the Nazis.
Yeah,
it's pretty intense. What I wanted to call in, so Stephen, I do breakdowns using Gematria in Hollywood. I cover a lot of Hollywood deaths and famous people connected to you know the rituals that I believe that do go on behind the scenes that no one really sees unless you understand Gematria. But Stanley Kubrick died on the 66th day of the year, and this is why I don't think he just died. Naturally, because 66 is a big number with the moon landing and lunar in general. Lunar equals 66. So if you're familiar with Gematria, it's just A equals 1, B equals 2, and so forth. And his death also ties in with George Millier's birthday. So, obviously, Stephen, you're familiar with A Trip to the Moon.
Mm-hmm.
So that movie came out 66, or the moon landing, quotations, happened 66 years after they released Trip to the Moon, which is a silent film, which is the first, film depiction of going to the moon. So this 66 is important because it connects to Saturn worship. 66 is a big number in Saturn worship. You're a movie guy. When is Damien from The Omen's birthday?
Oh yes, it was like what, June 6th, 1966.
It's 6/6. So the 66 number is very important. So Stanley Kubrick dying on the 66th day is, I think, definitely a nod, because if you add up the day that he actually died, then the actual day, 3/7/1999, it equals 128, and that's George Millier's birthday, is December 8th. So I believe that however Stanley went, but he was always going to die on that day because it lines up with Jules Verne, It lines up with George Méliès, and it lines up with the third in the batch, which was Stanley Kubrick, because obviously Jules Verne was the first to write about going to the moon. Back in the 1860, I believe 1867 is when he wrote From Here to the Moon, a direct route in 97 hours and 20 minutes. Which is funny because the moon is always associated with death. And for some reason, Jules Verne wrote in a direct route in 97 and 20 minutes, and death equals 97 and 20. So I always think that's kind of an interesting thing, because I think these people know, obviously they know. This
Tell us who's going to die next.
Well,
what's that?
I was just going to say, you always, with the numerology, is you always tell us who died before. I want to know who's going to die next.
I mean, well, there's so many people. I just did a good one on Natalie Wood, which is pretty interesting. But there's so many people who could die. I can't look at a million people. But when someone does die, I'm able to pinpoint it exactly, to be like, oh, this is how this person died, and this is why this person died on that day. And it never fails.
Right.
Were you going to ask something, Stephen?
Well, yeah, let me ask you, though, do you believe, though, that this is because there's some kind of cabal that's arranging these deaths to happen on a certain date, or is it possibly, let's just say, something more mystical that causes it? I mean, if you end
I think it's something more mystical. Because there is an organic side to this stuff. I can apply it. You can apply it in your life when you know it. I do think that there are certain groups, the certain numbers. I always bring up the Jesuit order a lot. Their numbers are always showing up. But at the end of the day, I do think, Hollywood is the new Babylon. It's very occultic, and I do think there's a higher force that's able to line all this stuff up, because the fact that they're always connected to their movies, to their life, to their film, to specific films, to other filmmakers. It's just too coincidental for it to be just all natural. So I do think there is a higher force, 100%.
Yeah, no, that's very much my feeling as well. I mean, I can just, kind of point to my own life with the number 17, because this is something that I've been obsessed with for years because of the fact that I was born on the 17th. And that was actually partly why I ended up doing what I'm doing now. Many years ago, I stumbled onto a blog called The Secret Sun, and I read a post that Chris had written called Edge of 17, which is really what put me down the path of synchro-mysticism and researching a lot of this crazy stuff. So it's kind of why when I see a lot of these numbers sort of show up, kind of getting into what I was talking about before, if you subscribe to the notion of the human soul, for instance, coming from outer space or something, I kind of think that maybe you see the basis of astrology, that the influence that these planetary forces have and how it shows up in your life in certain numbers or things like that.
Absolutely. And I'll leave you on one last one, because I know you've talked about the Black Dahlia murder, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Okay.
Well, here's something interesting. So this is where I come in. So that Elizabeth Short was arrested a couple years earlier for being drunk in public on a military base. Yeah,
it was 43, I think.
Yeah. Yes. So get this: when you look at her mugshot, there you get five numbers. You get 114 and then 19. She's killed on January 14th, 114, and she went missing on January 9th, 19. So in her mugshot, and that day was also the 75th day of the year, and Elizabeth Short equals 75.
Crazy.
So how can that connect in is definitely something higher, but I definitely wanted to drop that Black Dahlia one for you. And like I said, if anyone checks my channel out, Hollywood by the Numbers, I do like to break down a lot of the Hollywood rituals or powers that are above it that are causing these things to happen.
Cool. Everybody go check out your channel.
Yeah. All right. I appreciate it. Good show as always, Danny.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it, buddy.
Yeah. Thanks for calling, man.
All right. We're going to take another call. Please. What this will be about, God only knows. Slav, what's up, man?
Y'all hear me? Hello?
Yep. Yes, sir.
What's up, man?
Oh, what's going on? There was a little confusion with your name, so I'm gonna just call you Mr. Snider.
Works.
Yeah. Oh yeah. First off, not judging you. I'm looking in the back, kind of have the same problem as you.
What, too many damn
I like
books?
building. I actually had fun building a bookshelf. I think I want to get one. I want to make it like a rotating bookshelf. I don't know if you got space for that, but
Question, actually, Steven, do you coordinate? Do you have a bookshelf in your house? You must, right?
I have multiple bookshelves.
You must, right?
Yeah, if I could turn the camera a little bit like that.
How do you organize them? Is there any organizational strategy? Because I was shooting something earlier today, and the place we were shooting in, they had all their books organized by color, and I kind of dug that.
Well, the ones there on the shelves are roughly like organized just by, last name of the author or something. And then I have like the different stacks there, which usually are different subjects. Like, that's the Kubrick stack right there, for instance. Those are probably about to go in storage here. But yeah, that's my best attempts at organization. I used to drive my ex nuts with that one. That was for sure.
I bet. All right, what's up, Slav?
Yeah, so first off, I just wanted to say y'all were talking about Hugh Hefner and Playboy. First off, Penthouse is obviously a better magazine. And rest in peace, Larry Flint. He was a real ass dude. I mean, he was anti, Hugh Hefner, just shady ass motherfucker. So I had one question about humans and shit, but
humans and shit. Okay.
I mean the origin of humans, because somebody brought up, your origins, or talking about, skull structure. Things are brought up. But no, what is it? Hold on. Whoa, one sec. So when I was listening to you in the beginning of this episode, you know that whole saying about when you stare into the abyss, it stares back at you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And do you ever feel like when you're looking way deep into all this Kubrick shit that it either feels like he either just getting too deep or whatever? And then the other question was about the Jews, because people try and bring it up.
There's never been an episode where Slav doesn't have a question about the Jews. So,
what is up with Kubrick's kind of shady and obfuscated background? Like, he is Jewish, but he isn't Jewish.
Is he?
Changed, yeah, it says that he comes from secular Jews. He's Jewish, but I'm not, but I am, but I'm not. His father changed his name from different languages for whatever reason.
Yeah, but that's common. I knew lots of Jews whose parents changed their names just because it was impossible to pronounce or spell.
Well, in terms of Kubrick being Jewish, yes, and there's been a lot of dispute as to how exactly he felt about that. So the guy that he wrote Eyes Wide Shut with was a screenwriter called Frederick Raphael, and he wrote a book called Eyes Wide Open that detailed his time working on the script of Eyes Wide Shut with Kubrick, and he made some rather provocative statements about Kubrick's feelings about being Jewish. Namely, probably the one that really got the most attention was Kubrick saying something to the effect that Hitler was pretty much right about everything as far as it concerns Jews.
Dude, you're making Slav hard right now.
I've solidified my thoughts on him. I know the biggest mistake he made in his whole trajectory in history, but go ahead.
So Kubrick only had a handful of Jewish characters in his films. In fact, he typically changed characters that were identified in the source material as Jews and converted them into goys, or whatever you want to say, basically. The only really noticeable exception of a prominent Jewish character in a Kubrick film is actually the Victor Ziegler character in Eyes Wide Shut, who there is no basis for in the novel that it was based upon, Trauma Novelle. Kubrick actually had that character and the whole storyline added from scratch to the film. And there was a lot of let's just say, hand wrangling between him and Raphael over the development of the screenplay. Raphael actually wanted to have a lot more explicitly Jewish content in it, and Kubrick apparently put the kibosh on all of it. He also, see, there was the comment he made about Schindler's List too, supposedly to Raphael, where Kubrick had said there had never been a good movie made about the Holocaust. Raphael asked him, what about Schindler's List? Kubrick said that the Holocaust was about 6 million Jews that died. Schindler's List was about 6,000 that lived, or something to that effect. So Steven Spielberg came out and said that he apparently did not recognize Stanley Kubrick's voice in any of these statements or anything to that effect. But who knows? It's also interesting to note that Kubrick's wife, his final wife, the one that he had daughters with, Christiana Kubrick, her uncle was a prominent figure in the Nazi Party. In fact, he was a major filmmaker for propaganda films for the Nazi regime and made one of the most notorious anti-Semitic films produced during the Nazi regime. So,
quite an accomplishment.
What was that called?
It's quite an accomplishment.
What's the name of the film? What's the name of that film?
I do not remember it here off the top of my head, and I would probably butcher the pronunciation. But if you look up Christiana Kubrick, her uncle should come up like right on Wikipedia.
Yeah, no, I mean, whenever anybody says like, oh, they said something hateful or anti-Semitic, or they wrote this and that,
Veit
like,
Harlan.
I just feel like, okay, what did they? Yeah,
Yes,
I just want to
Harlan,
know
there
the
you go.
title or whatever. What is it called?
His
The
name
guy's
is
name-
Veit Harlan, Veit.
Yeah, that's cool. And then
His
it's
movie was
interesting that you brought up
Yud Sub.
Yud
Yud
Sub.
Sub.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that what is it? You brought up the Nazis. You know, they're interesting. They have an interesting, you know, backstory and everything. And you guys are mentioning Hollywood and CIA and Kubrick's involvement, you know, with the moon landing. And then obviously NASA. So like all this stuff with Operation Paperclip and the Jews involved. So there's been this one thing that they've changed with the visa programs. I mean, this is a little more new. It's just this thing called a U visa. Like if you're, you know, in the country as an alien and you undergo a crime, like you get robbed or something, like either trying to become a U.S. citizen or whatever, a resident.
If you're the
you
victim of a
get,
crime?
like, yeah, okay, yeah. They've been doing this in L.A. and Chicago. They'll set up fake immigration robbery gangs. Like they'll fake a robbery on somebody, and the person goes into the office being like, "Hey, you guys know me. I'm illegal, but I've been robbed," and then they'll get amnesty, right?
Okay.
They just run these scams.
Okay.
I looked up on the actual website. The only exclusion on that type of visa is if you've been involved in crime as a Nazi, in genocide or, you know, anything involving with the Holocaust. But they don't do it for anyone else. But they just changed it fairly recently, where before it was, you know, you could have been Khmer Rouge or African war criminal,
And that's fine. You're saying? Are you saying that they removed the Holocaust?
No,
the Nazi thing?
They just narrowed it down. So, what is it? What was Stanley's, like, how close did he get to the Nazis when he was working, like, alongside NASA and all that? Because honestly, I don't think we went to the moon. Like, I know motherfuckers went to space, but I don't think we went to the moon. We can't do it today for some reason, but, you know, they say it was all Nazis, and they say, like, what, Kubrick helped, you know, because what, NASA just recently admitted that, like, yeah, we made fake films in case we couldn't make it. We just want to scare the Russians.
So,
yeah.
So
go ahead.
Are you asking, like, if Kubrick had some kind of connection to Operation Paperclip or something?
Well, no, everyone that was brought along with it.
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm
Yeah, I don't know what the question is here, Slav.
Whatever. Okay, I'll just end on this last question because just because y'all were talking about like the origin of people. Do you believe all humans come from chimpanzees from like West Africa? Because me personally, I'd rather be, because like I'm a Russian, I'd rather be glad that I came from Neanderthals and Denisovans rather than from chimps or whatever created abos or plants. Just your question.
All right, thanks, Slav.
Just like, what do you think humans come from?
Okay, thanks, man.
I mean, I think that's a little above my pay grade. I mean, I do think the theory of evolution had some serious issues with it after we discovered DNA. I mean, this is something that Darwin, was not aware of when he developed the theory of evolution. I really think that DNA kind of upended a lot of that, but it's just not something that we want to talk about now very much because, there is a lot of institutional inertia in keeping Darwinism enshrined, I guess, as a sort of prevailing paradigm right now in the 21st century. But again, this is probably above my pay grade.
And you wrote, because I was meaning to bring this up, but you wrote a book in 2020, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, Post-War Nazis, Mercenaries, and Other Secret History. That covers a lot of, I guess, just like Nazi influence?
Well, the big thing I really got into with that was Colonia Dignidad. In fact, I think at the time when I released that, it might have been the largest or the longest English language account of Colonia Dignidad.
What is that?
It's an interesting place. It was a colony founded in Chile, I believe around late 1950, early 1960s by a guy called Paul Schaffer. Schaffer was a former Nazi, as were many of the individuals who helped set up Colonia Dignidad. It became just an absolute epitome of horrors going into the 60s and 70s. It was effectively set up as a torture center by Pinochet during the worst periods of the Dirty War after the counter-revolution that started on September 11th, 1973 there. And getting into the late 70s as Operation Condor took off, you had a lot of people throughout the Southern Cone who were disappeared to Colonia Dignidad, where they were systematically tortured and in many cases executed. As the story goes, they had a vast underground facility set up with these torture facilities there. It was quite horrendous, but it was not the worst thing that actually was happening at Colonia Dignidad. Besides being a former Nazi and an arch torturer, a guy who collaborated with military regimes left and right, Herr Schaffer was also an arch pedophile. In fact, he had had children flown in from Germany. He had had children abducted from the local villages around the colony that he had sexually abused, and that was ultimately what led to his downfall. Was this just litany of abuse that was going on there. And there were just some really disturbing things besides the obvious that comes up with this. One of the points that I really wanted to drive home in writing this was that a major supporter of Colonia Dignidad was the German politician Franz Joseph Strauss, who was for many years a leading figure in Le Cercle, which could be described, I suppose, as the right-wing version of the Bilderberg Group.
Okay.
It started as an offset of the Bilderberg Group in the 50s, but it was almost exclusively drawn from Catholic countries in the early days. The top members were all members of Opus Dei, the Knights of Malta, a lot of these other groups. And it also seems that the people who established the Cercle, i.e. people like Franz Joseph Strauss, Konrad Adenauer, oh gosh, I can't remember the Italian politician's name. He was like the prime minister a dozen times. But these were essentially the guys that had all been tasked with running the Gladio networks throughout Europe. These were the stay-behind armies that the CIA and the Pentagon had set up in the event of a Soviet invasion, and frequently they were implicated in acts of terrorism in these countries. So Le Cercle was knee-deep in all of that, but there's also a lot of evidence that it was actively involved in pedophilia. Specifically, it turns up really heavily in the Dutroux affair in Belgium, all the protests that broke out with all of that. For those of you unfamiliar, Marc Dutroux was this serial killer in Belgium who had abducted these children. He was found to have kept them in cages. He had all of these underground facilities at his various residences across Belgium that they were kept in. And as police began to investigate it, it seemed quite likely that this was part of a broader network, that he was probably procuring these kids for senior figures in Belgian politics. Some of these people, like the Black Baron, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, were major figures in Le Cercle. So this is where this gets really unsettling. The Cercle's tied in with Colonia Dignidad. It's getting kids brought in from Germany and these other places for Paul Schaffer to sexually abuse. You got other people connected to the Le Cercle network in Belgium that are also knee deep in this really creepy, I mean, I suppose there's not any other kind, but in this case, especially disturbing child abuse. I mean, this is where you start seeing these stories coming out of kids being hunted, you know, in these European manners by this old guard nobility and stuff like that. And, you know, just again, this ties into a lot of the things with the Gladio networks, with the similar Condor in South America, and the fact that there was probably this underlying network of sex trafficking involving children, if all this stuff wasn't unsavory enough to begin with.
Right. And in the bio, it says there's a link somehow to Trump.
Yeah. I mean, that would be more, I believe, with the private military companies, but Trump, a lot of his backers were also tied in with this Le Cercle network, especially in the UK, when you get into things like the Monday Club, some of the people that were tied into that, like
What is that?
Well, the Monday Club was a ginger group within the Tory party in the UK. It was a lot of right-wing politicians, people like Julian Amory and stuff
What do you mean
like
ginger? Like they're redheads?
that. No. I don't actually know what the British say, what exactly they mean by that, but you just hear them sometimes saying it's like a ginger group. I think it's like saying it's an unofficial group or something like that.
Okay.
One of the quirks that our cousins have, so they like to throw ginger out there like that. So who knows? But anyway, the Monday Club was one of these far right groups. They were sort of tied in with like the Claremont Club, people like Sir James Goldsmith. And this all ties into that network with Michael Milken.
The trader? The stock trader?
Yeah. Because I mean, Trump actually pardoned him when he was the president.
Right, because he was in he was like
Burnham Lambert.
Yeah, he was like the famous, like what was like junk bonds or something?
Yeah. And I mean, again, you got to remember, he also knew Roy Cohn, and Jeffrey Epstein was a part of these circles as well. So that's like a big thing, is the stuff with Michael Milliken and all the stuff with Drexel Burnham Lambert. Nobody really looks at, but you've got other people like Leon Black, I believe the head of Apollo Capital, who was a major donor to Trump. I mean, he was big with the Drexel Burnham Lambert circles. You had Sir Jimmy, who was also one of the major figures who started the Brexit movement. A lot of his old associates, I think one of his son-in-laws or something, continued to be major financial patrons of that. So yeah, there was just some really, really strange stuff that went on with Drexel Burnham Lambert and a lot of the people that are tied in with that from the 80s up to this day.
Right. Mark says a ginger group is a formal or informal group within an organization seeking to influence its direction and activity, from the phrase ginger up.
Ginger sounds way cooler than just saying it's an informal group. That's why.
Sure. Yeah. They're onto something there. All right, let's take another call. One moment, please. Let's see who we got. I believe this is Frank. Are you
Hello?
there, Frank?
Hey, what's up, guys?
What's up, sir?
All right, so from the top, help you out with the human origins type thing. We are not from apes at all. We're our own species. So it's kind of like, dogs and cats. Dogs didn't turn into cats and cats didn't turn into dogs. There's either dogs or there's cats. Kubrick. So Kubrick really liked to co-opt scripts, kind of like he takes a script and then he kind of like weaves in this hidden message. There was a documentary a little while ago called, I think, Room 223. I don't know if you guys were 227.
237, room 237.
Yeah, so I just noticed that, you know, like what woke people are doing now with what they're doing with all the movies is they're pretty much co-opting scripts to push their own, I guess, narrative. Kubrick was doing it in a more valiant way, where he was actually trying to expose a lot of this stuff. Eyes Wide Shut was definitely, you know, no pun intended, an eye-opening experience when I saw it, because it was just everything that, you know, we could research on, you know, the old internet was pretty much put out there for everyone to see. I mean, nowadays you have two kinds of hunt movies. One that you were just referring to, where they bring in the kids and they hunt them in a mansion. I think one of them's called The Hunt, and the other one's called Ready or Not. I don't know if you saw that movie. But yeah,
I just
mean,
keep rewatching Northern Exposure nowadays, man.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Tubi the whole time. I advise everyone to get off their you know, cable and just get high-speed internet, and you know, just go on Tubi and go on the free stations. I mean, Freevee and Tubi. But yeah, no, that's it. I mean, you know, Eyes Wide Shut, Disposable, Plebs. You know, AIDS was a message in there too, but I think it was just a scare message. I mean, regarding AIDS, I don't know if you guys know, but Fauci's resume was actually to manage fake pandemics. So
Yeah.
AIDS was
apparently he's. I never saw the movie, but now everyone's saying in Dallas Buyers Club, like he was the villain essentially in the movie, even though they don't reference him by name. But there's like, I guess, some doctor who's trying to stop them in Dallas Buyers Club, and everybody says it was like based on Fauci.
I mean, yeah, this is what I usually do. Like, you know, and this is how I think, and maybe it'll help other people too. But you know, everyone has a resume, and they submit their resume, and they see the experience. So this guy submitted his resume to whoever that was in the cabal controlling the mRNA and Pfizer vaccines and whatever. And his forte was to manage fake pandemics. So you have AIDS, and AIDS was supposedly caused by HIV, which is wrong. It's a retrovirus. It's a completely harmless virus. And what they were doing was that they were killing people with the medication.
That's
and
what
the medication was
with Arthur Ashe, right?
Yes, I believe so. And the thing is that they had all this oncological medication that was supposed to be used to kill cancer, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they repurposed it as an AIDS drug, and it started killing gay people by the hundreds, and everyone was just shriveling up and dying, just like remdesivir. Why does this matter? Because got back to the Kubrick thing. I mean, you know, all these elites just want to, if you want to take it and kind of crystallize it and pinpoint it, the whole thing is that dehumanization policy, depopulation policy. And they just want to steer and manage all of this from afar. And I think Kubrick did a lot of good work with, you know, just kind of, I mean, I think Eyes Wide Shut is definitely his most on the nose movie. And I'll take this answer offline, but he died right after that movie, correct? And was there any foul play? And this is another just random question too, is that Anthony Bourdain, is there anything did he really kill himself? Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, I'm not a specialist in Anthony Bourdain, though. Was he the one that was married to Gia Argento, or no?
Yeah,
he was. Okay,
yeah,
so
he
that
was.
is interesting.
He was married to her, and then she was, I guess, really mean to him or something, and then he killed himself.
Well, it's just interesting because, I mean, she was sort of an early person to really blow the whistle on, you know, some of the Me Too stuff as well.
And then there was some like 16-year-old male model came out and said that she basically like sexually assaulted him or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because on top of that, her father's Dario Argento, and you know, the famous Giallo filmmaker, the Italian horror author who did Suspiria and a lot of this other stuff, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff in Argento's movies, to put it mildly. So, you could do a lot, I mean, just with a Freudian analysis as to what it would have been like having Dario Argento as a father and growing up around that, I think. But
Sure.
yeah, there's some really weird stuff with that. But for Kubrick, like, again, he died on, I think it was March 6th or March 9th. I can't remember, 1999. So this would have been 4 months roughly, I believe, after or before Eyes Wide Shut was released in theaters, which it was July 16th, 1999 when it hit theaters. So he would have died in post-production during the editing process, right? Supposedly when the editing was just about done, but before the film had been submitted to the MPAA, which is what would have necessitated the cuts, and that's what has generated a lot of the controversy with the mass ball sequence, because they did those CGI images, for instance, of models imposed over some of the more graphic sexual scenes, and it's long been speculated that that might have been used as cover to maybe cover up some of the other explicit occult references in that sequence.
Sure. But it doesn't seem like, there's plenty of movies that are explicitly full of occult stuff. It would seem like that doesn't seem like that would necessarily preclude a movie from being shown.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't, like I said, that's why I don't necessarily see, at least in my opinion, that there was anything conspiratorial with Kubrick's death and that. I mean, if anything, I feel like Eyes Wide Shut, along with Barry Lyndon, are his two most personal movies. And I feel that in a lot of ways, Eyes Wide Shut was almost a reflection on his life. I mean, it was a movie that he had begun the process of adapting it at least back in the early 1970s. So this is a film that he had been working on for almost 30 years by the time that it ended up in the theaters. It was very personal to him. And I really feel like it's a reflection on his concerns with his daughters, because if you just, kind of go back and look at the women in the film, I mean, they're almost prostitutes in one way or another. And I feel like in some ways, Tom Cruise's journey can almost be read as a reflection on the paths that his daughters might be going down. Of course, you have the scene where he ends up at the guy's house after he's died, and his daughter, played by, I think it's Miranda Richardson, basically throws herself at him. You find that her fiance looks almost exactly like the Tom Cruise character. You got the sequence with the costume shop owner who's basically pimping his daughter out. You've got the other prostitute who I actually think is a part of the cult, who was basically there to proposition him. The Tom Cruise character can almost be seen as a stand-in for Kubrick. He's a social climber who's entered into these rarefied circles, kind of personified by Ziegler. And it really mirrors Barry Lyndon's journey as well, where he starts out as kind of this rogue. He ends up conscripted into the army. He's basically forced to become a spy against his own countrymen. And by guile, he essentially ends up in the British aristocracy, a position that he can't hold for a prolonged period of time. And I kind of feel like, in a sense, that is a reflection of how Kubrick viewed himself. He saw himself as this sort of social climber, a guy who was just clever enough to kind of get into the periphery of the circles of power, but who always kind of remained an outsider and who was always in this precarious situation. And I think specifically with just the Miranda Richardson sequence in Eyes Wide Shut, I find that heartbreaking in a lot of ways, because supposedly Kubrick wasn't aware of Vivian joining the Church of Scientology up to at the time of his death. I personally do not buy that in the slightest. But that whole sequence, originally Jennifer Jason Leigh had been hired, and they had done the whole sequence with that. And then Kubrick had wanted to go back and reshoot it. And that's why you end up with Miranda Richardson playing the character, because Jennifer Jason Leigh wasn't available. So you have this scene where this wealthy man has just died, and his daughter is throwing herself at Tom Cruise, an arch Scientologist. I really can't help but feel if that was maybe a parting statement for Vivian.
Sure. All right, let's take one more call, and then we're gonna wrap this up, and then we actually are gonna bring Mark on because he has a question for you as well. One moment. Really? We got Dylan on the line. Dylan, you there?
Yo, what's up, fellas?
How's it going, man?
What's up, man?
Hey, I don't know. Hopefully this question sparks some sort of response, but I would assume.
Are you going to ask me about the Jews?
Absolutely not. No. I was just gonna ask you about like other other directors, I guess, maybe in like opposition to Kubrick, or maybe there's like a guy that's kind of like leading or trying to follow in his footsteps, that's trying to do these symbolic, like esoteric truth bombs in his movies, or like I said, if there's any like opposition.
I feel like the appetite
And,
for
like,
that right
people
now
trying to cover it up.
is kind of minimal in Hollywood,
Well,
like for
actually,
producing stuff like that.
I mean, if you were to ask me like the antithesis of Kubrick, I would say beyond a question, David Fincher. I greatly dislike Fincher.
Not a fan.
Going back to Fight Club, actually, because frankly, I mean, everybody thinks Fight Club is this big, anti-establishment film, and I just don't get that at all. I mean, it's basically a guy suffering from dissociative identity disorder who founds a cult to carry out terror actions. Their great plan is to try to wipe out the credit or something in the country by blowing up the building at the end. I mean, if you actually did that in real life, there would be mass hysteria the day after. You would have a martial law implemented. To me, that movie is it's almost like a propaganda piece in creating the modern alt-right or something, which is very much, I would say, a co-opted movement if it wasn't AstroTurf to begin with. And Fight Club, I think, was a big part of how that was created. And I think when you go in and look at Fincher's other movies, it's a persistent pattern. I mean, I was deeply offended by his adaptation of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I mean, that's just, if you've seen, what was it, the Norwegian version of it, I mean, it's brutal in parts. It's hard to watch, as it should be, because that's a brutal story. There's a lot of just disgusting stuff that happens in it. And you see Fincher's film, it's like a freaking Hitchcock movie or something. He's like glorifying this stuff. I mean, just compare like the rape sequence in the Norwegian version versus the one in Fincher's film. You're like in tears watching the Norwegian film. Fincher, I mean, it's almost, I don't even want to get into that, but I mean, yeah, I feel like Fincher is a guy who definitely aspires to make these Kubrickian type films, but in a establishment supporting fashion, as a willful tool of psychological warfare. I mean, I suppose Kubrick did that as well, but I mean, certainly I don't think with any semblance of populist inclinations as occasionally you could maybe see in Kubrick's work. Sorry, that was just my David Fincher rant. It's something I have a lot of emotions about.
Sure. You seem to be.
No. Just could I ask you, do you have any thoughts about Oliver Stone, or no?
He's an interesting one, isn't he?
Yeah.
I always have really wanted to like Oliver Stone, but let's just say some of the circles that Sean Stone has shown up in has given me question. And then Oliver Stone, again, he really kind of came out of a lot of those leftist activist circles I was talking about at the beginning with Michael Douglas, like the pro-Sandinista circles and things like that. And, again, I think like the Douglas family, Kirk Douglas, yeah, I mean, he did some stuff politically that I agree with, but on the flip side of the coin, this is a guy where there's some pretty credible indications that he might have raped Natalie Wood. He was suspected in the Black Dahlia killings at one point. So yeah, I mean, that's not to say that his son should be tarred with any of that, but for various reasons, I have certainly wondered about that whole milieu that came out of some of that activism in the 1980s, some of the people that were tied in with that, and certainly some of the groups that Oliver Stone and his family have become involved with later on.
Right. Well, all right, fellas. Love you, Danny.
Cool. Thanks,
Thank
dog.
you, Steven.
Nice talking to you
Peace
too,
out.
son.
Appreciate it. All right, let's bring Mark on, and then we're going to wrap this bad boy up. Well, please thank you, Stephen, for joining me today, and everybody for watching. I appreciate you all. Mark, you there?
Yeah.
What's up, Mark?
What's up? Great episode. Great chat. Make sure you like the show. I don't know. Maybe I was taking notes and I missed this, but so maybe you brought this up already, Danny. But the Shining, Stephen, what do you think about potential clues to maybe Kubrick's? I know you said he wasn't directly involved, but maybe indirect involvement with the whole alleged fake moon landing stuff, because there are a few compelling details in The Shining that would make one think that he was saying something more with that, with those little details. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that's interesting because see, that's the one film that they really kind of that Kubrick made where you can maybe explicitly draw these parallels. And this would have it came out in 1980, which was a little after Kubrick would have first been linked to the moon landing. So, as I said before, the first person to do this, to push this notion was William Casing. And Casing, though, probably got major assistance in being platformed by the late, great Mae Brussel. She was one of the early conspiracy titans. She was kind of the left-wing version of William Cooper for many years, though certainly she was a better researcher than William Cooper, just saying. But anyway, Mae Brussel, really interesting person. So the person in turn who really got Mae Brussel up and going was Paul Krasner, the longtime publisher of The Realist, and he knew a lot of other interesting people. He knew people like Robert Anton Wilson, the Yippies, like Abby Hoffman. He actually worked for Larry Flint for a time too. Krasner also did a lot of interesting research into Charles Manson. He was one of the first people to bring up those pornographic tapes from Polanski and all this other stuff. So here's where it gets kind of interesting. Stanley Kubrick was a huge fan of The Realist. That's where the sense of humor of Dr. Strangelove really came from. Apparently, Kubrick had actually wanted to hire Lenny Bruce at one point, who was a good friend of Krasner's, to work on the screenplay for Dr. Strangelove. Bruce turned Kubrick down, so he hired Terry Southern instead. Terry Southern was another guy who wrote for The Realist at times. He was in the same orbit with Paul Krasner. Kubrick had been subscribed to The Realist since the late 1950s, shortly after it first took off. So it would have had a very small audience at that point in time. It's entirely possible Krasner knew that Kubrick was a subscriber back then, and I think that if he didn't then, there's a really good chance that Terry Southern would have told him that later on. Kubrick was still reading The Realist all the way up through at least the time he made 2001. So I've kind of started to wonder about this because Kubrick, he had a really dry sense of humor on the one hand, and he was a bit of a megalomaniac on the other hand. Stanley Kubrick wanted to be perceived as something other than a regular director. A Stanley Kubrick film, it wasn't just a movie, it was an event. It was something you were supposed to tell your children about what you were doing the first time you saw that Stanley Kubrick film. So Casing's coming on Mae Brussel's show, talking about Kubrick faking the moon landing. Mae Brussel even had him host her show at least one time when he talks about Kubrick. Excuse me, not faking the moon landing, but being involved in this. So part of me kind of wonders if maybe Krasner was nudging Brussel to do this stuff, partly to maybe nudge Stanley Kubrick because he knew he was a reader, or possibly Kubrick himself might have been suggesting that Krasner do that. And then you kind of come out a few years after Mae Brussel's got Casing on, he comes out with The Shining. There's all those references in there to him possibly faking the moon landing. So I have to wonder if maybe we're seeing a little bit of Kubrick's famous dry humor and maybe a little bit of his megalomania driving the moon landing hoax allegations on his part more so than his actual involvement.
Okay. Okay. Are you going to be talking about all the Kubrick stuff at the Astronosis conference coming up in August?
No, I actually just had a great ideal for that. Imaginary prisons that have stalked humanity's collective unconsciousness since the Renaissance onward. It's going to be great. We're going to get into freaking The Labyrinth from Hellraiser, House on the Rock, all kinds of other fabulous
Nice.
stuff.
Where's
This
that?
one,
Where's
it's
that happen?
it's going to be near Chicago at the Theosophical Society's headquarters on August 8th and 9th. And, or actually, I think it's the 9th and the 10th. It's one of those two. It's the Friday and the Saturday. And I believe I'm going to be leading a pilgrimage to House on the Rock on the Sunday after that, my presentation. So that'll be interesting for people who can join me with that.
Cool. All right. Well, go check them out. And where can people find you?
You
Otherwise.
can find me at the Farm Podcast. I've got my own Patreon set up for that and what have you. Also, the VISUP blog, which is at VISUP, VIEW, all one word, visupview.blogspot.com. And my books are all available at Amazon, as we've all been saying. The recent one is The Minotaur, a Kubrick Odyssey. Definitely check that out if you've enjoyed the show tonight. It's got a lot of groovy stuff in it. And we didn't even cover Kubrick's possible involvement with the strategy of tension in the UK, the Concora Boys Home scandal, and his cousin Paul, the convicted murderer who was put in prison by Vincent Bugliosi, Charles Manson's prosecutor. And that in and of itself is a fascinating subject.
Crazy. Well, definitely go check out your book, check out your podcast, check out your blog. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Stephen, for coming on. I appreciate it very much. We will catch you, some of you, hopefully, or all of you, tomorrow night on a brand new episode of The Bathhouse, live at 9 p.m. from the Stand Comedy Club. All right. Good night, everybody. See you soon.
Good night, guys.
All my shit heroic. Empathic abilities, yeah, my face be also stoic. Bleep, blow up, nigga, that just means I'm working. They see me as a leader, so that's why I'm Captain Kirkin. These tracks from the stars, that much is for certain. You can feel this hit if you up or if you hurt. I'm raising my stock, not talking my feet in some Birkin. Number Johnny 5, got a fucking short circuit. Bring the track to life when I speak phenomenal. When I hit, she feel that shit in her abdominals. These rappers make me laugh like comic view, they comical. You know I got a ball out, I hit the track running just like Sonic do. They don't wanna turn on my light switch. Yeah, they was trying to get me on my hype shit. Yeah, they don't wanna turn on my light switch. Yeah, and they tried to down me on some KO type shit. Yeah, they don't wanna turn on my light switch. Yeah, now we pulling up fresh on some flight shit. Ha. They don't wanna turn on my light switch. Yeah, they don't wanna turn on my light switch. They don't wanna turn on my light switch. Yeah, they was trying to get me on my hype shit. Yeah, they don't wanna turn on my light switch. Yeah, then they tried to down me on some KO type shit. Yeah, they don't wanna turn on my light switch.